Welcome back to LIS570. This week we're going to continue our discussion of research, data collection, and analysis methods. This week we're moving on to quantitative methods though. So we're first going to talk about 3 techniques for collecting data, and then we'll talk next week about how we'll use those techniques and the data that they render to do some analysis. All right, let's jump in. So what we're going to talk about overall this week is we're going to try to situate quantitative research methods within our conceptual foundations of library and information science research. Then we're going to move on to how we think about quantitative research from a deductive logic standpoint. And from there, I'm going to introduce this idea, which is central to the way that we design and operationalize quantitative research, which is using variables such as an independent or a dependent variable to measure constructs and then ultimately show either a causal or descriptive characteristics of our data. Okay, then we'll jump into and talk about 3 particular methods that we can use for data collection. The first is going to be surveys, then we're going to talk about experiments, and then we'll end by talking about kind of emerging methods around trace or log data, administrative data analysis. All right, you're probably sick of seeing this diagram, but I think it's helpful to always remind ourselves conceptually what's at stake when we're committing ourselves to a paradigm and when we start to explore a set of research methods, that is data collection and analysis, techniques or tools to make sense of the world around us. Now, we talked about in LIS, in particular, there's 3 particular commitments that we'll make. There's ontological commitments, which have to do with reality. There's epistemic commitments, which have to do with the way that we accept knowledge of or true justified beliefs about that reality. And then we have methods or tools and techniques which we use to justify, that is, gather evidence for the beliefs that we hold. And these 3 things together bind us to a particular paradigm. Now, we've talked almost exclusively in the class so far about constructivism as the paradigm which aligns with oftentimes qualitative research. Now, constructivism has ontological commitments around reality which see it as socially shaped or socially constructed and built. As such, oftentimes the data that we collect and the way in which we analyze it requires us to make some interpretive moves which are known to have biases, which we accept as part of the research process. Now, positivism takes a slightly different approach in the way that it conceives of collecting and analyzing data, but at its foundation, it's substantively different from the commitments it has to, say, a reality that exists, that is, the positivist believes that there's a true reality, and that if we reduce bias in the design of our project and the execution of our data collection, then we can come at, or we can arrive at, justified beliefs which have a truth value, which is with a capital T. These things actually exist in the world. They're not socially constructed. They don't have biases. They have a existence which we can know and which we can prove or verify that we know. Now, the methods then that we use end up being things like self-reported data in the form of surveys, but we try to generate enough survey responses that we move to almost a population level instead of sampling. We use methods such as administrative data, which is collected from online forums where we assume there's little bias in the way that people talk or describe or interact with one another. Or we use something like an experiment where we have maximum control over a set of characteristics, or what we'll talk about next as variables, which we can measure and we can manipulate. And so we should understand and know then the outcomes. The point that I'm trying to make here is that when we think about the 2 major paradigms that we've talked about so far, there's a logic sitting behind positivism and a logic sitting behind constructivism, which shapes the way that we not just think about what the right answer is, but how we go about getting answers in the first place. So we talked about last week that induction is the way that we go about getting those answers in qualitative research. That is, we start from a particular example and we move to an explanatory generalization. In that process, one of the things that we're doing is we're coming up with explanations about maybe why some event or some person or some group of people think feel and act the way that they do. Now, deductive is going to work almost oppositely. We're going to say we have evidence that people have thought, that people have acted, that people believe certain things. Now, we want to maybe twist, manipulate, or change one particular aspect of the maybe whole host of things that people believe and see if there's an effect. So what we might do then is design some intervention, which we can take that manipulation and control it and change it such that we can observe what happens when we make that intervention or make that change. And we probably have some ideas about what will happen if we make that change. That is, we'll have a hypothesis, we'll make some intervention, and then we'll try to measure what that looks like. So if we think about this in kind of the deductive logic paradigm, what we're doing is we're taking an existing information source and we're looking for its truth value. That is, we're looking for its ability to be accurate and verifiable across populations. We're getting narrower and narrower to some ultimate truth or something that's verifiable based on a set of existing theories. Now, what the deductive logic or the positivist researchers trying to do in the design of their research, right, is, as we said before, reduce bias. We're trying to remove the possibility that there's some sort of external force which is going to impede or affect the way in which we're setting up something to be measured. Because this would, of course, if you believe that there's some sort of truth or true reality out there, impede your knowledge or your beliefs of that thing. If we think about the hypothesis from the verifiability of a kind of positivist standpoint, right, this is what binds us to, say, knowing or not knowing something. That is, we probably believed that we were going to see some effect from our intervention. And if we don't see it, then we can't have justified knowledge, right? We can't have a true understanding of, say, a set of behaviors if what we expected to see is different than what we actually saw. So the hypothesis gives us a whole kind of rationale behind why we design a particular intervention in the way that we do. Now, when we make our observations, what we do is come to a set of conclusions pretty quickly after that, right? We decide whether or not we should reject or accept our hypothesis. So we'll get into and we'll talk about what this actually looks like in the setting of particular data collection methods. But I want you to keep in mind this notion that we're stating hypothesis up front, and then we're coming to a conclusion about that hypothesis later. All right, so far we've talked almost exclusively about how we identify theory and how we state hypotheses. But if we go back to our deductive logic kind of framework here, we're moving from hypothesis then to a set of observations. And I've said kind of all along that we can manipulate or we can intervene for a set of observations that we make, which will ultimately either reject or confirm our hypothesis. If we think about really what we have the ability to manipulate and change, we have maybe experimental conditions which are characteristic of, say, a general sample or a population. We think of those characteristics as being independent or dependent variables when we're doing quantitative research. So independent variables are exactly as they sound. They're characteristics or things about, say, the world that we can't necessarily control or that we won't be changing in order to try to make some observable phenomena occur. So time, for example, is a really good observation around, say, independent variables. We oftentimes can't manipulate time, right? We can't slow it down. We can't speed it up. The only thing that we can really do with an independent variable like time is measure it differently. We can measure it in milliseconds or we can measure it in months. Now, dependent variables are also just exactly like what they sound. They are dependent upon, say, some other thing that we control or that we manipulate. So, for example, test scores are a great example of a dependent variable, right? A test score depends on, say, how much time we spend studying, maybe how much time has elapsed since we first took a test versus the last time that we took a test, right? A test score is going to vary. It's going to depend on, say, independent variables, or it's going to depend on, say, a set of things which we can control and we can manipulate as researchers. So for example, if we are going to say plot independent versus dependent variables, we oftentimes put the independent variable along the x-axis, and we put the dependent variable along the y-axis. And then we look for some relationship that exists between, say, those two variables. So if we're here thinking about the amount of time it's been since we took a test, right? At the beginning, we're probably pretty poor at taking tests, and over time, maybe we show some improvement. So our test scores actually go up the more time that's elapsed. Right, so this would suggest that there's some sort of relationship between how long it is since we took our last test or how many tests we take and the scores that are being marked. Okay, so I think it's important to note then that we design interventions, that is, we design for observational contexts by manipulating or changing dependent variables and then measuring both independent and dependent variables. But we also have a set of variables that oftentimes we can't really account for, but we know that they might impact, say, the results of the experiment or the survey that we're running. And we call those something like confounding events. So, confounding variables within an event. So think about, for example, one of the most massive data collection campaigns that happens in the United States, which is the census. In 2020, we have a confounding variable around maybe how many people respond. That is, we have COVID-19, we have a pandemic, which is interrupting the ability for people to maybe have access to computers in which they can fill out and submit their census forms. We have census enumerators going door to door, people that may not want to talk and interact with, say, a stranger that's knocking on their door trying to get information about their census, right? All of these things are confounding variables which impact, say, response rate, which impact, say, census measurements. And we'd have to, as responsible researchers, account for or understand those confounding variables in some way. So we'll talk about particular techniques that we can use to report and describe those when we move on to the analysis and reporting sections of the class. But here I just want to note, you may be coming across this term in your readings, and you may also be thinking about sort of the different types of variables that may be at play. Okay, so for the rest of the lecture, what I'm going to try to do is unpack some different data collection methods that we can use in the quantitative tradition. And those tend to be surveys, experiments, and what we'll call trace or administrative data. And just like with qualitative data, I'm going to try to unpack sort of what the instruments we can design and build are, what are the overall value, how we do things like sampling, and then the way that we should think about these methods kind of in practice of library and information science. All right, so let's start out with the survey, which I think we're all inherently familiar with through things like I just said, the census, to things like polling. We understand at sort of a base level what a survey consists of. It often starts with some demographic information, such as our name, our age, our location, maybe even things like our birth dates that have particular like structure to them, right? Our gender identity, etc. Okay, so what we're trying to do with a survey is oftentimes about collecting data at a scale which will allow us to generalize in ways that, say, interviews won't. That is, we have the ability to collect information in a structured form, similar to the questionnaire that we ask with interviews, but we're not looking for the kind of open-ended response of self-reporting, meaning-making data that happens in an interview. We're looking for the self-reported structural data that can allow us to create statistical explanations for why people think or feel or behave the way that they do. So I think it's important here to think about then the kinds of variables that we can use when we're doing, say, the collection of information on a survey. So we typically have two types of variables that we'll come across and that we'll use within the survey methodology. Those are categorical variables and numerical variables. And we can probably infer exactly what those things mean. So we have categorical variables, which are going to be the categories that we construct. Now, some of these will be what we might think of as nominal. That is, they have a range of answers which we can limit or we can construct. So if we're doing something like a gender identity, right, we can construct a whole range of genders. We can allow people to enter their genders, right? So a nominal recording of those will be something of our kind of own construction, but there's not going to be any ordering of one being better or worse than the other. Whereas ordinal, there's going in the categorical variable will be exactly that, right? We can have small, medium, large. We can have any number of ways in which we order, say, a scale or a preference in order to collect some information about a category. So if you've heard of the idea of a Likert scale, this is oftentimes a 5-point measurement that goes from maybe very satisfied to not very satisfied. This is the kind of scalar measurement in an ordinal categorical variable. Okay, so opposite categorical variables then are going to be numerical variables, which are oftentimes of, again, two varieties, either discrete or continuous. By discrete, we mean something like a birth date or a year. That is, it has a particular structure and form to the way that it can be shaped, or the way that it can be reported. Continuous variables are kind of any real number, right? We can think about things like temperature measurements. We can think about degrees of satisfaction, etc. So I think it's important to understand in surveys that besides just being kind of the run-of-the-mill way in which we collect data at a large scale, and the way that we have replicable surveys, that is, we can do the same census question asking and answering decade over decade in the United States, for example, what we have there is our ability to shape and collect categorical variables and nominal variables. If we move on to experimental research in the context of library and information science or social science more generally, we can think about this as oftentimes a very expensive, time-consuming, and somewhat difficult method of collecting data. But it's also the way in which we can collect data that we have the most control over conditions that we may want to test or manipulate. So as a data collection method, it's going to be hard, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be time consuming, but it's probably going to give us the direct way that we can measure or that we can report, say, data that we believe to be about some, say, event or some activity. Now, when we're looking for evidence of people's behaviors or people's preferences, oftentimes what we're trying to avoid, especially if we're working from a deductive standpoint, is that biasing or that shaping. So what we can do then with an experiment is try to limit those biases by administering, say, a set of activities or a set of reports that a person gives to us through, say, an interface that we build in a computer, maybe eye tracking that we do by asking someone to report the queries or the search strategies that they have on a page. Right? All of these things are ways in which we can take things like independent and dependent variables, use dependent variables in manipulating the way that we're going to, say, record information about those individuals, and then typically take that log, so the results that happen from our manipulation of the dependent variable, and start to report it in, say, maybe some analytic frame. We'll talk more about what those analytic frames look like in just a couple of lectures. But I think one of the things that's important to remember about the experiment as a technique that we can use in social science research is that we have the ability to manipulate and we have the ability to report based on those manipulations. Now, experimental research is oftentimes quite contentious in the social sciences when we do something that seems manipulative or seems coercive. What I think is a really great example in, say, LIS research in particular is the publication that I mentioned here that I'll also put in the lecture notes, which is about the way in which we try to shape informational resources and then experiment with, say, variations in the way that we shape or the way that we publish those information resources on particular populations. I encourage you to take a look at this. It's looking at a particularly oftentimes vulnerable information demographic, which is older adults and their interaction with internet-based health resources. All right, so the last quantitative data collection method that we'll talk about very briefly here, and that you also have a chance to read more about in your readings this week is what we might think of as trace or administrative data reuse. So the logic here is that oftentimes, based on our online behavior or online, say, activities which may demonstrate or act as a proxy for our motivations, leave traces behind which we can infer and make sense of through, say, statistical analysis. Now, in doing this, what we have is almost natural experiments. That is, we don't have to impose and maybe construct a intervention. We can just look for maybe disruptions to service, or we can look for something that will allow us to, say, measure a dependent and an independent variable. And oftentimes this happens just as we interact across the web. So the value of doing or taking, say, a trace data analysis, which I'll give a couple of examples of in just a minute, is that it's relatively low cost, right? We don't have to do anything other than go out and collect data that's already been logged. Now, oftentimes we have to clean up and maybe manipulate and massage that data in order to make it combinable with other resources that we have. But for the most part, right, there's no sort of limitations to what we can collect from this particular approach. The drawback, though, is that around sampling, we don't have an ability to purposefully sample, right? So oftentimes, if we're collecting, say, Twitter posts, or if we're looking through subreddits for discussions of unethical behavior, right, we don't get to say who posts there and who doesn't, how often they post, whether the posts are dominated by a particular couple of people, right? We have to just sort of work with what exists in this naturally occurring experiment. So what we have as a kind of, what we gain in terms of scale, we have a drawback, undeniably, in terms of representation and in terms of sampling. Now, the instruments that we're going to use to obtain this kind of trace or administrative data are oftentimes going to be about having direct access to maybe an administrative account in which data are logged, or we have the ability to use something like an application programming interface or a way in which we can request data from a particular system. The information that we get back or that we take from trace administrative data is going to be oftentimes structured information that we're going to have to impose some experimental conditions around, right? Because again, remember, we didn't design this, so we didn't get to pick out what's the dependent and independent variable. We're only going to be able to do that really at the administrative stage, or I'm sorry, at the analysis stage. So it's worth thinking about oftentimes when we're analyzing and kind of scratching our head and looking at a data source. If we're going to have to structure this and we're going to have to impose some dependence or independence around variables or characteristics of that data, what's going to act as what, and how do we do that? So here's an example of what I think is a really neat, very recent research which looked at power users within public and academic libraries and the way in which they, over time, began to shift from ebooks to, or from, I'm sorry, print books to ebooks. This is something that we probably all intuitively think that we know something about or that we can guess what the answers are. And I think there's some unintuitive results based on this particular study. So I'll have to also encourage you to look at that. Okay, so just to sum up this week, we've talked mostly about deductive logic, and we've talked about the way in which we start to put a positivist paradigm to work in terms of three particular methods. We looked at the survey method, we looked at the experimental conditions method, and then we looked at trace or administrative data as a data collection method. Next week, what we're going to talk about then is how we analyze data that results from these types of studies. And we'll even do some exercises which are going to help us look at existing survey data.